A millionaire lay dying, beyond the reach of modern medicine. Every treatment had failed. Then, out of nowhere, a young boy appeared in the hospital corridor and said, "He's still in there." No one believed him, except the daughter who was about to lose her father. And from that moment on, everything began to change. Privia Care International Hospital stood in the heart of the city, a cold, proud block of glass and steel where everything ran on protocols and technology. The intensive care unit was on the 6th floor, a place so quiet that even footsteps echoed like in a cathedral. Room 6-0, AK Wamtit. A soft red light glowed above the door. Inside, Marcus Ellington, 68 years old, founder of Ellington Corp., a leading tech conglomerate, lay motionless. His eyes were shut tight, his skin pale. Only the ventilator kept a faint rhythm of life going. 3 weeks had passed since he'd been admitted. The medical team had exhausted every option: plasma exchange, neural stimulation, stem cell therapy. None of it worked. It was as if Marcus's brain had quietly withdrawn from the fight. Outside the ICU, along the hallway, a bench pressed against the wall. Sarah Ellington, Marcus's only daughter, sat upright, hands resting on her thighs, completely still. She wore a dark coat, her hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, a silence that no longer tried to maintain composure or hide the weight it carried. The door to the ICU opened quietly. Dr. Nathan Corbin, Chief of Cardiology, stepped out. Under the sterile white light, the tension in his brow and the dark circles under his glasses were impossible to miss. He paused in front of Sarah, waiting as if for a question. She didn't move. Corbin spoke. "There's nothing more we can do. His nervous system is no longer responding. We've tried everything. You should start preparing yourself." His voice was calm, neither cold nor comforting, but leaving no room for hope. Sarah gave a faint nod, almost mechanical. No words followed. Corbin turned and walked away. She sat there, alone in the thick silence, her fingers gently holding an old necklace around her neck, the only thing her mother had left behind. She didn't cry. There was no need. The pain now was too quiet for tears. A soft footstep echoed from the end of the hallway. A boy, around 13, with loosely curled hair and a thick grey jacket, hands tucked in his pockets, was slowly walking toward the ICU. He saw Sarah. She noticed him too, but didn't react right away. The boy stopped, stood still, and looked straight at her. His gaze wasn't curious. It wasn't pitying. It was calm, deep enough to make an adult uneasy. Sarah frowned. She didn't recognize him. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp and clear, not softened the way adults usually speak to children. The boy answered, without moving forward or stepping back. "I heard it." "He's still here." Sarah froze. The words weren't loud, but they rang out clearly in the empty hallway. "What did you say?" She instinctively gripped the chain around her neck. "I said he hasn't left. He's still in there." Sarah stood up, her heels clicking lightly against the stone floor. She took one step toward him. "Who do you think you are? A boy? Some kind of miracle healer?" Her voice was laced with sarcasm, not loud, but sharp as a fine blade. The boy didn't flinch. He looked at her, then spoke with a calmness rare in someone so young. "I've been there, where he is now. I know what it feels like to want to give up. But I came back. Let me try, just once." Sarah said nothing. No one did. The sound of the ventilator in the ICU pulsed steadily through the thick glass. She didn't believe in miracles. She was a realist. But she'd sat here for 3 weeks, watching doctors come and go, watching report after report land in front of her like lead weights. And now, a boy like something out of a dream was standing in front of her, saying what no one else dared to say. "Let me try. Just once." Sarah didn't speak. She just looked at him for a long time. Those brown eyes didn't look away. They didn't plead. There was only a quiet certainty in them. She turned her head to the ICU door. Her father lay inside still, cold, and distant, like a planet gone dark. He had once been the strongest man in her world, but over the past 3 weeks, that strength had drained away with every shake of the doctor's head. She used to believe in science, in treatment plans, in data. She believed that without evidence, there could be no miracles. But now, standing between a strange boy and the father she was about to lose, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Sarah didn't sleep all night. She sat in the same position for hours on the long bench outside the ICU hallway. Her hand clutched a thin silver necklace, a rusty keychain shaped like a tiny piano, something her mother used to wear. The hospital's glass doors gradually brightened with the light of dawn. The first rays of sunlight pushed through the misty glass, making everything feel more distant, more cold. At the far end of the hallway, Malik was still there, the curly-haired boy, in a worn-out jacket, quiet like a little tree shadow. He was still waiting, saying nothing, not leaving. She walked over, not to begin anything, but to put an end to what no longer made sense. "You should go home," she said, her voice hoarse and tired, but still clear and rational. "Thank you for talking," she added, "but this isn't something for you to carry." Malik looked up. His gaze didn't change, calm, without resistance. "I understand," he said. Sarah gave a slight nod, then turned away. She didn't look back. She still believed what she had once been taught, that medicine had its limits, but every effort must be grounded in what can be verified. 1 hour later. ICU room, 608. Marcus's heart monitor began to show erratic signals, a brief disruption in the EEG. His heart hadn't stopped, but the ventricular rhythm scattered. The nurse immediately called Dr. Corbin. He arrived quickly, opened the file, reviewed the latest vitals. "His condition is clearly deteriorating. The brain is starting to show localized oxygen deprivation. We'll need to consider withdrawing life support within the next 24 hours. Sarah stood behind the door. She heard every word. Corbin stepped out, his voice steady and low. "I'm sorry." "He's slipping away." Sarah didn't answer. She stared into the space ahead, blinking slowly. In her mind were disjointed fragments. Her father's hand on her shoulder the day she failed her first college entrance exam. Her mother, who died in just 48 hours after a cerebral hemorrhage. And now, the last person she had left, drifting into a place with no way back. She stood up, left the hallway, walked quickly toward the elevator. Her heart was pounding, not from hope, but from a sense of urgency, unlike anything she'd ever felt. She couldn't just stand by anymore. The staff housing wing. Sarah couldn't quite remember which room the boy was in. She only remembered that last night, Malik had come from this direction. She asked a few orderlies, then found a small room on the 3rd floor. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Malik was sitting and reading. An old book with a torn cover, in French. "Do you remember what you said last night?" Sarah stood at the threshold, not inviting. Malik closed the book, looked at her, and nodded. "You said if you had 1 hour, you'd try. And if nothing changed, you'd leave." Sarah stepped inside. A breeze from the hallway gently pushed the door shut behind her. "I'm giving you 1 hour." Her tone was clipped, firm. "But just 1 hour. If there's no response, you can't go into that room again." "Yes," Malik replied. As he followed her, Malik reached for the strap of his backpack, a reflex so ingrained it had become second nature. Inside was a small drum, the surface worn thin. the edges of the hide gently peeling. It was the only thing he'd kept from when he came back. No one really knew where he'd come back from, but records from the South End Treatment Centre once noted reflex recovery linked to non-linear drum rhythms. He didn't fully understand the mechanics. He didn't need to. He only knew this. There had once been a sound that pulled him out of the darkness. Now, he was only trying to do the same, like a familiar call, to those still stuck inside. A few minutes later, Sarah walked straight into Dr. Corbin's office, holding a folder with the signed authorization papers and the liability waiver all filled out. She didn't wait to be invited in. As the door clicked shut behind her, she spoke directly. "I want to allow that boy into my father's room." Corbin looked up from his paperwork, his brow tightening slightly. What did you just say?" "I signed the forms. I take full responsibility. Just 1 hour." Corbin took off his glasses and set them on the desk. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Sarah, you know I understand how this feels. I stood in that same place 12 years ago, when my mother was dying from kidney failure. But that's exactly why I chose this path. Medicine doesn't allow emotion to take the lead." He tilted his head and looked at her, his voice now lower. "That boy, he's the son of a medical assistant. No formal education, no grasp of biology, no concept of neural damage. My younger brother knows more than he does. This is unscientific, and if word gets out, it could damage Dr. Marcus's reputation." Sarah didn't argue right away. She stood still, one hand gripping the folder. "I didn't choose that boy because of his background or education," she said clearly. "I chose him because I have no hope left but him. And if I keep ignoring that, I'm not sure I'm still my father's daughter." She set the folder down on his desk. Her tone was brief, decisive. 1 hour. You don't need to approve. I've signed. It's legal." Corbin looked at her for a long time. In his eyes was a mix of duty, hesitation, and a quiet, creeping fear, the kind that comes from losing control. At last, he nodded very slowly. Sarah turned back down the 6th floor hallway. Malik was there, waiting. He didn't ask anything, didn't smile. She said nothing, just opened the ICU room door. For the first time in 3 weeks, the door wasn't opening for a doctor. The ICU door closed behind Sarah. Inside, the overhead light cast a cold white glow over Mr. Marcus's face. His skin had turned pale, the veins clearly visible beneath the thin layer of flesh. The ventilator kept working steadily, its indifferent rhythm echoing like the heartbeat of an empty machine. Malik stood 1/2 meter from the bed. He wasn't looking at the monitors. He didn't care about the numbers flashing on the screens. He was watching the man lying motionless, as if waiting for a signal from something no one else had the patience to hear anymore. The faintest fragment of life that still remained. He slipped the canvas backpack off his shoulder and placed it on the chair. From one of its pockets, he pulled out a small, round, black object made of leather, an old-style Ghanaian hand drum. The drumhead was slightly worn, the wooden edges lightly scuffed. No one knew when he had started carrying it. Malik sat down on the floor, cross-legged. He didn't say a word. He looked toward the bed and placed both hands on the drum. A soft beat rang out. Thump. One sound. Gentle, warm, like a tap on a mother's palm. Not loud, not urgent. Malik kept his eyes on Mr. Marcus. He didn't blink. Thump, thump, thump. 3 beats, evenly spaced, as if calling out to someone lost in a deep sleep. He went on like that, patient, unhurried. Behind the glass door, Sarah stood watching from the hallway. Beside her, a resident nurse Hannah quietly observed the vitals monitor. "Nothing unusual," Hannah said softly. "Heartbeat is stable, brainwaves still within range. No signs of consciousness yet." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the room, where the boy kept drumming steadily, never once looking up. 15 minutes passed. Malik held the rhythm. Now he changed the pattern. A short beat, a long one, then short again. The sound was soft and steady, like tapping into the stale air of the room. Suddenly, the middle finger on Mr. Marcus's left hand twitched, very slightly like a tiny muscular reflex, not clear if it was intentional or unconscious. Hannah leaned toward the monitor. "There's a slight movement." Fingertip sensor picked it up. Very weak. "Can't tell if it's muscular or neural." Sarah blinked. Could it be the machine's spasm cycle? Hannah shook her head. Number skeletal motion isn't part of the device's reflex loop. This is coming from inside. Malik stopped. He stood, stepped closer to the bed. Then he took out a small pouch made of waxed cloth, tied with a bit of rope. Opening it, he pulled out something unusual. A worn, crumpled piece of paper with a black and white photo printed on it. It was a picture of a man standing by the ocean, his hair blown by the wind, a smile that was awkward but genuine. Beneath it, in shaky ballpoint pen, were the words, 1996 Santa Cruz. The boy placed the photo on Mr. Marcus's chest, over his heart. "You've been there, haven't you?" Malik said softly, as if the man could still hear. "That place hasn't shut its doors to memory. I know it." He placed his right hand on the photo, his left hand on the drum. Thump. A single beat. Then silence. In the monitoring room, Hannah muted the alarm. The screen showed a small change, a brief brainwave spike, out of rhythm, heart rate up by 3 units, and Marcus's eyelids twitched, once, then stopped, not open, not awake, but a clear response to sound and touch. Malik lowered his head, gently, said nothing. He didn't celebrate, didn't sigh in relief. He just touched the photo with 2 fingers, as if returning it to the man's heart. The door opened. Sarah stepped in. No one spoke. The room stayed quiet. She walked slowly to the bedside, her eyes locked on the numbers on the screen, confirming she hadn't imagined what she just saw. His hand. It moved. Hannah nodded. Peripheral movement registered. Reflex wave detected. "I'll page the resident physician now." Sarah looked at Malik. What did you do?" Malik simply replied, "I just called him." But it had to be the right way, the right rhythm, because not everyone sleeps the same. Sarah looked down at her father. Part of her still resisted. She wanted the doctor to come, explain, verify. But another part, the part she'd buried long ago, was trembling. Malik had already left the room. Sarah remained alone. The air conditioner stirred lightly against her thin lab coat, but she didn't feel cold. She looked at her father, his eyes still closed, his face still expressionless, but his hand had just moved, slightly, clearly, and the monitor had recorded an unusual wave. Sarah stepped closer, placed her hand on his shoulder. "Dad, if you can hear me, then please repeat that. Just once." He stayed silent, but his lips, which had seemed completely still, quivered slightly. A slow, faint response, but unmistakably human, not mechanical. Sarah took a deep breath. She couldn't fully believe it, but for the first time in 3 weeks, she didn't feel alone. She glanced at the clock. 8:44. There was still time. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Small conference room, 7th floor, Clinical Operations Wing, 8:57 a.m. Dr. Raina Joe, head of neurology, closed the patient's file and set it down on the glass table. This is the first time in over 20 days that patient Marcus Ellington has shown brainwave activity outside of the suppression cycle. Right index finger movement was detected by the biosensor at 8:36, accompanied by involuntary lip tremors. But it's still not enough to conclude intentional response. In the room with Dr. Joe were Dr. Corbin, resident physician Rami, head nurse Hannah, and 2 members of the hospital's medical advisory board. Sarah was not present. She was still sitting by her father's bedside. Based on the vital signs, the patient remains in a temporary vegetative state, Rami said cautiously. I don't believe these movements were conscious or controlled. We've seen similar cases before. But there's a difference, Hannah said, leaning forward slightly. The timing of the reflex coincided with the moment the boy, Malik, was delivering continuous auditory stimulation. Dr. Corbin remained silent. His fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the tabletop. His gaze settled on the file, the one Sarah had signed just hours earlier. I'm not saying the boy meant any harm, Joe said, eyes still fixed on the data. But we can't establish a link between the biological signals and behavior that falls outside clinical protocol. He's not a medical professional. He has no authority to directly interact with a critical care patient. An advisory board member, Mr. Kessler, the legal officer, interjected. The issue now isn't who that boy is. The issue is, if the media finds out that a high-profile patient was treated using a folk remedy, we're going to face an investigation. Sarah is his daughter, but the hospital still bears responsibility if there are any complications. The room went silent. No one dared speak further, because everyone understood. In medicine, silence carries a particular weight, not agreement, but the unwillingness to bear the consequences. Dr. Corbin looked up. I'll speak with Sarah directly. As for the boy, he's not to be allowed near the patient for now. I don't want to see a serious case turned into viral content on social media. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Sarah remained at her father's bedside. Her hand rested on the edge of the bedsheet. On the small table beside the bed sat a photo of Santa Cruz, left behind by Malik. She didn't know why he had that photo, or what it meant. But her father once told her that the ocean was where he felt closest to her mother after she passed. And now, that photo rested on his chest, perfectly placed, as if it belonged there. The door opened. Dr. Corbin entered. Sarah didn't turn around. We've had a meeting, he said, his voice tight with restraint, and we've decided no further non-traditional treatments will be allowed at this stage. Sarah turned to face him. She wasn't surprised. You're worried about your reputation, aren't you? Corbin frowned. We're worried about losing a patient. We're following proper protocol and professional ethics. What protocol kept him alive these past 3 weeks? Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on her father. Now, for the first time, he's showing a response. And that's what scares you. What scares us is if this happens again and he stops breathing. Who's accountable then? Corbin stressed every word. You! That boy! Sarah didn't respond right away. She looked down at the photo. After a pause, she stood up. A child with no medical training, no knowledge of neurology, but enough patience to sit for an hour and call out to my father with a drum, while the people paid and licensed to be here just upped his meds and told me there was no more hope. No one answered. Corbin stared at her. I'm not against medicine, Sarah added, her voice low. I'm against complacency and the fear of taking responsibility. Then she picked up the photo and walked out of the room. No one stopped her. Scene shifts to the lawn behind the hospital. Malik sat under a tree, quietly tapping out a small rhythm on his drum. Sarah approached. This time, she was the one looking for him. She handed the photo back. Malik took it and carefully tucked it into a cloth pouch. They're not letting you in anymore, Sarah said. Malik nodded. Not sad. Not angry. I figured. Sarah sat down next to him simply. Would you show me how you did it? Malik looked at her. A breeze moved through the brown hair she had tied neatly at the back of her neck. He didn't ask why, just took out the drum and began to tap, slow, soft, each beat like the pulse of someone just beginning to remember who they are. Rumors spread faster than bacteria, especially in a sealed, cold space, like a large hospital. The morning after the incident in ICU room 608, the hospital's internal management system began receiving a flood of unusual reports from the night shift. A medical intern quietly left a note in the monitoring software. Patient Marcus showed finger reflex after external contact. Another nurse reported, cardiac monitor recorded mild EKG fluctuation not consistent with treatment time. Though unofficial, these lines were enough to make the entire system tighten up like a reflex. On the 4th floor, a small conference room lit up at 6:45 a.m., a full 90 minutes earlier than usual. Dr. Corbin sat at the head of the table. Deep lines creased his forehead, dark circles framed his eyes. His left hand gripped a red pen tightly, as if it might help him contain the rising fury. In front of him sat 5 attending physicians and 3 lead coordinators. Outside the door, passing nurses could hear one sentence loud and clear. No one, and I repeat, no one is to allow that boy near the ICU patients again. A young female doctor raised her hand, meaning to ask something, but Corbin's look made her shrink back. He didn't need a medical explanation, he cited corridor policy. Anyone without a license, without therapeutic clearance, is not allowed in a level 3 critical care zone. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. Something wasn't being spoken, not because they didn't know, but because they weren't allowed to believe. Sarah leaned against the hallway window, arms clutching a folder. The morning light made the glass clearer than usual. She saw her own reflection, tired, hair unkempt, eyes on the verge of breaking, but not from lack of sleep. It was the question still unanswered. Who was that boy? And what really happened in the hospital room yesterday? A quiet voice rose beside her like it came on the wind. You know, Malik used to be a patient here. Sarah turned. It was Hannah Lynn, a seasoned nurse, with her hair pinned high, voice soft, but always distinct. She rarely spoke during meetings, but this time she didn't blink. I took care of him. Back when Malik was 10, high fever, seizures, no reflexes. Every reading was bad. And then he woke up, nobody understood how. Sarah froze. Why hasn't anyone told me this before? Hannah glanced around, then lowered her voice. Because they closed the file. No clinical evidence. No one wants to turn an unexplainable survival into the center of a medical controversy. You know how this place works. Sarah walked away. She didn't say a word, but inside her was a breathless churn, like someone had just cracked open a truth she'd been standing too close to see. She went to find Corbin in his office. Didn't knock. He looked up. Before he could speak, Sarah laid the folder on his desk. Malik's medical records. Is there a reason they disappeared from the public search system? Corbin exhaled. He wasn't surprised, but he didn't deny it either. Because there was no reason to keep them. No statistical value, no verifiable clinical markers. That wasn't treatment, it was biological randomness. Sarah didn't move. You don't think that at the very least, someone who had a loved one in a coma, deserved to know. He looked at her. For a long moment. He didn't argue. But in his eyes was something deeper than anger, fear. Not fear of what had happened, but fear that the truth would no longer stay buried. That afternoon, Sarah sat alone on the fire escape stairs. Her phone lit up with a notification from the system. New regulation. Access to room 608. prohibited outside of treatment hours. It wasn't a medical directive. It was an administrative decision. She didn't smile, didn't sigh. She just stared down at her phone, as if looking through a sheet of clear plastic, everything still visible. But no longer something she could touch. Something had changed that day. Not just Marcus reacting, not just the boy Malik walking through the ICU doors, but the way the system had started to tremble, not because a patient woke up, but because someone dared to look at an old file. The sky opened up at 6 in the evening. Fine rain blew sideways along the hospital corridor, clinging to the edges of the windows and gathering into droplets. Sarah held an umbrella, walking slowly between 2 rows of buildings in the staff housing complex. Her shoes were wet with mud. A corner of her white coat wrapped around her leg, soaked and cold. She had never taken this path before, never imagined a day would come when she'd find herself walking past the low buildings with rusted tin roofs and moss-covered porches where the support staff lived. But today, she needed answers not from the hospital, not from data, but from the one person she believed had seen it all. Room 17 stood slightly ajar when she knocked. Malik appeared, his face as still and quiet as always. He didn't speak, just stepped back inside. Sarah walked in. The warm yellow light cast a soft glow across the worn cement floor. Near the corner of the room, a woman was wringing a cloth in a basin. Her hands were stiff, the fingers slightly curled and rough from years of work. She turned, gave a small nod. Alia. They sat across from each other at an old wooden table, between 2 cups of steaming tea. Malik stayed silent, sitting by the window, flipping through a notebook with frayed leather edges. Sarah leaned in to look. It wasn't a book, but a handwritten journal, filled with strange symbols and cryptic descriptions. Sarah spoke first, her voice slow. "I want to know, what happened to your son when he was little?" Alia set her cup down. She didn't answer right away. She smoothed the front of her blouse, then said in a steady voice, "When Malik was 8, he had a high fever that lasted 5 days. Seizures. He lost consciousness. The doctors here told me to prepare myself. They said part of his brain might have suffered permanent damage, that if he survived, he wouldn't be the same." Sarah tightened her hand on her lap. "I studied nursing in Ghana," Alia continued. "Not enough to practice here, but enough to understand that if I let medicine do everything, Malik would slip away without hearing his mother's final words." Outside the window, the rain fell steadily, like a quiet, unchanging rhythm beneath the unfolding story. Sarah didn't interrupt. She simply listened. The warm, yellow light in the room made everything feel close, as if time had slowed down to make space for memory. Alia went on. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady and sure, like a familiar footstep in the night. "I held him for 5 nights straight," she said. "I drummed beside his ear softly, just like my mother used to do when I was little. I wasn't trying to heal him. I just told stories. The day he was born, how scared I was. I rubbed oil into the soles of his feet, patted his back with every breath, all of it, just to keep him there, so he wouldn't get lost." Sarah felt a bitter dryness in her throat. A faint, tingling sensation crept along her spine, as if her body were realizing something before her mind could catch up. Alia didn't say another word. She stood up, went into the room, and returned with a bundle of papers folded into quarters, tied together with a piece of frayed cloth. She placed the bundle on the table and gently pushed it towards Sarah. "I wrote down everything I did," Alia said. "Not to teach anyone, just so I wouldn't forget." Sarah opened it. Old pages, handwritten notes mixed with traditional symbols, simple pencil sketches. No charts, no metrics. but each line felt like it carried a moment of real life, a kind of memory held in the body, not in theory. Every point of contact, every breath cycle, was a way of holding on. Sarah asked quietly, though she already had a sense of the answer, "Why didn't you publish it?" Aaliyah only smiled. There was no bitterness, no resentment. "Because I wasn't curing a disease," she said. "I just didn't want to leave my child behind." When Sarah stood up to leave, Malik was still sitting at the edge of the doorway. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. But as Sarah walked past him, her eyes paused on the small notebook in his hands. The back cover was blurred by water, but the writing remained clear. What can't be seen doesn't mean it doesn't exist, only that no one's been patient enough to stay. Sarah stepped outside. The rain was still falling, light as mist. She didn't open her umbrella. Raindrops slid down her cheeks cold and wet. But for the first time in years, she didn't try to tell if it was rain or something else. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about numbers. She wasn't thinking about functional recovery. She wasn't thinking about treatment plans. She was thinking only of a hand one that never pulled away through 5 long nights. A mother, in silence, had held on to her son's soul, simply by staying. The 6th floor of the hospital was eerily quiet. Outside, a light fog draped the glass-walled corridor. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. that hour, when all machines operate by reflex, no longer aware. The door to ICU room 608 opened with barely a sound. Malik stepped in. This time, he didn't come alone with just the drum. In the pocket of his worn coat, he carried something small, carefully wrapped a piece of faded fabric, frayed at the edges, smelling faintly of old lime. It was a shirt that Sarah's father used to wear, back when he would stand on the balcony facing the ocean at the old villa on the southern coast. Sarah had found it in an old wooden box at home and handed it to Malik that afternoon. No one followed him. The night nurse didn't notice. Marcus lay the same as ever, motionless. Only the green light on the ventilator blinked. But Malik didn't look at the monitor. He looked at the man's face longer than usual, as if to make sure he's still here, even if he hasn't responded yet. Malik turned on the handheld recorder, pressed play. The sound wasn't loud, not jarring, just the steady, distant rhythm of ocean waves. No birds, no wind. Only water, the deepest, most patient sound in nature. He placed the recorder at the head of the bed, then pulled the fabric from his pocket, folded it once, and gently laid it across Marcus's left palm. He whispered, so no one else could hear. "You stood in front of the ocean once, didn't you? Wind in your hair. Back then, you believed you still had so much left to do." He sat down, resting the drum on his knees. But this time, he didn't start playing right away. Malik sat still, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The first beat sounded like wind slipping softly through a crack in the door. Then came the second, and the third. Not rushed, not threatening. More like a message to someone about to sink beneath the surface, that up here, someone is still waiting. On the vitals monitor, the heart rate line was no longer gently wavering. It climbed more distinctly now. The BPM rose from 44 to 53, not high, but steady. Malik didn't look at the machine. He kept tapping steadily, his trembling hands sinking with the sound of the sea. His forehead tilted slightly, damp hair falling over sweat-soaked brows. Suddenly, another long beep echoed. Marcus's fingers twitched not one by one, but his whole hand tightened slightly, almost gripping the fabric. Next, his eyebrows gave a clear, involuntary jerk. Outside the door, Sarah had been standing still for a long time. She didn't call out, didn't step in, just watched through the glass. Her heart thumped like a drum in her own chest. The monitor couldn't lie, but what she was seeing went beyond anything measurable. A young resident, Eric, was walking the ICU hallway during his night shift. The pale yellow light spilled onto the cold tile floor, stretching his shadow into a faint blur. He was about to keep walking when the vitals monitor outside Marcus's room suddenly lit up. He stopped in his tracks. The line on the screen, flat as a lake bed just moments ago, was moving. Clearly, repeatedly. Not static, not a glitch. Eric held his breath for 3 more beats. Then he spun around, bolting toward the nurse's station, phone already in hand. "Call Dr. Corbin, right now." Inside the ICU room, the soft drum beat continued, steadily. Unhurried. Unforced. Malik closed his eyes and tapped out 3 final beats. Then he stopped. A long pause of silence followed. He leaned down and rested his forehead against the back of Marcus's hand. Not a word. Not a single unnecessary motion. Only the recorder kept playing the sound of ocean waves. As if the room at the heart of the hospital had drifted far out to sea, detached from all rules, all scientific boundaries. Malik stood up. He lightly touched the edge of the table, turned away. When the door opened, the clock read 2:47 a.m. No one stopped him. Not because they didn't know, but because this time the silence wasn't indifference. It was genuine confusion. The not knowing had begun to replace the arrogance. The night shift nurses, who had once whispered it was just a childish ritual, now lowered their heads and stared at the vital signs monitor for a long time. As if for the first time they believed in what they themselves had once scoffed at. Sarah stood still, quietly watching from behind the glass. She didn't enter the room, didn't speak, didn't cry. Her gaze settled on Marcus's hand, once twitching slightly, now motionless again. On the floor lay a small, silver-grey cloth, cut from the shirt he'd worn in a photo taken at the beach. It had slipped from his hand. But the way it fell didn't look like it had simply dropped it, looked like it had been released after being held. Sarah couldn't measure that with any device. No numbers, no proof. But she saw it, and for the first time she was certain it couldn't have been coincidence. A man thought to have already left this world had just stirred a part of himself to hold on to something he once had. 2 days after the second reaction. Tuesday, 7:12 a.m. Dark clouds hung heavy in the sky, casting a shadow over the entire Privia Care hospital campus. It seemed like any other day until the internal phone on the administration floor began ringing non-stop. A 23-second video had been uploaded to an anonymous account. The footage, shot from an angle through the hallway glass, zoomed in on ICU room 608. In the blurry frame, a man clearly lay motionless, yet his hand twitched slightly. On the monitor, his heart rate steadily climbed. Beside him stood a brown-skinned boy, gently tapping a small drum in slow rhythm. The clip was shared on a natural healthcare forum. Within 3 hours, it had made its way to a local television station. By 9 a.m., dozens of reporters had gathered at the hospital gates. Inside the administrative wing, the air felt thick. An emergency meeting was called in room 4F. CEO Dr. Joe sat at the center of the long conference table, holding a printout of a still frame from the video. In the internal meeting room on the 8th floor, the glass doors were drawn shut and white light beamed directly down onto the tabletop. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the soft hiss of the air conditioning could be heard overhead. Director Joe stood in front of the screen. He didn't need to introduce himself. He simply raised his hand and pressed a button. The video appeared. An elderly man, Marcus, lying motionless. A dark-skinned boy in a dark jacket was placing his hand over the man's. A small movement. Then 2 old fingers curled slightly. From the low camera angle, the vitals monitor blinked with a green light. The video ended after 18 seconds. Joe turned off the screen. He turned around, his eyes sweeping across everyone seated at the table. No one dared meet his gaze. "This is what's been circulating online," Joe said, his voice steady and low, like a stone dropping into water. A quiet exhale. "Can anyone here," he continued, "tell me who that boy is, and why we didn't control this content before it went public?" No one answered. After a moment, Corbin slowly rose to his feet. His face looked more hollow than usual. His lab coat was wrinkled, tie slightly off-center. He placed both hands on the table, his weight leaning forward. "Directors," he began, "I take full responsibility for the boy's access to the patient. He's the son of a long-time medical assistant, Aaliyah Iboa. He's been in the inpatient ward a few times before. I didn't assess the risk properly." Joe showed no reaction. He gave a slight nod. And another voice spoke, a senior advisor, about the video, the movements. Corbin didn't raise his head. He answered like a copy of himself. "There's not enough evidence to call it a recovery. From a neurological standpoint, it could be a spontaneous reflex, possibly involuntary movement caused by alpha wave activity. The patient's condition remains unchanged." Joe stepped toward the head of the table. He placed a thin folder on the wooden surface and gently slid it to the center. "The issue," he said, "is right here." No one reached for it. Joe opened it himself. Internal report, diagnosis code MAL0510. Patient, Malik Iboa. Date of record, 5 years ago. Symptoms, prolonged high fever, delirium, altered consciousness. No response to targeted medication. He looked up, and his voice slowed, each word carefully measured. Then, a full recovery. No surgical intervention. No specific treatment notes. But he pulled out the final page and held it up. "There's this line. Presentation beyond standard medical parameters. Unverified. Not recommended for disclosure." This record wasn't filed in the main archive. It was pushed into a subfolder, hidden from clinical search results. The room fell into a heavy, undisturbed silence. Joe placed the sheet back on the table. His eyes stayed fixed on Corbin. "So," he asked quietly, "was it because the boy made an unexplained recovery, and we dismissed it instead of investigating further?" Corbin said nothing. One hand clutched lightly at the edge of his coat. The other hung at his side. Joe didn't wait for an answer. He returned to his seat and slowly pulled out the chair. "We're not talking about miracles here," he said. "We're talking about professional responsibility, about the limits of the system, and something we've long forgotten. Not everything we don't understand is wrong." Silence held the room. Corbin glanced over but said nothing. His hand, however, had clenched so tight the knuckles turned white. At that same moment, in the hospital cafe, Sarah sat alone at a small table by the window. A man in his 40s approached. Salt and pepper hair, long coat, badge and press ID. Michael Prentice, Channel 8 News. He didn't ask for an interview, didn't lift a camera. He just sat down and slowly placed a printed still frame from a video in front of Sarah. Her face reflected in the glass, watching Marcus in the moment his hand moved. "I know you were the last one to sign off on letting that boy in." He spoke softly. Sarah said nothing. One hand held a cup of coffee, still untouched. "I'm not here to write headlines," Prentice added. "I just want to know, as someone's child, do you truly believe in what's happening?" Sarah didn't meet his eyes. She looked past his shoulder, out at the wind-swept courtyard. In that moment, she remembered the first night Malik beat the drum and how her father's hand clenched, as if touched by something long familiar. "I can't explain it," she said quietly, "but I believe in what I saw." At the executive office, Corbin remained alone after the meeting. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at Malik's old file. The yellowing pages held handwritten notes in red ink where the words "Cause of recovery unknown" had been crossed out in black pen. No signature followed. Corbin turned to the last page. The final line was written in his own hand. Recommend discontinuing archival. Avoid setting precedent outside clinical medicine. He closed the file. His hands trembled slightly. That afternoon, outside the hospital gates, the crowd had grown larger. Some held signs. Let the boy continue. Faith never killed anyone. Patients aren't just data. An elderly woman in a wheelchair held up a handwritten sign. My son once woke me, not with medicine. Security had put up barriers, but the murmurs still echoed into the lobby. Sarah looked out through the glass doors. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. In the archive room, Hannah Lynn opened an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a stack of dusty files. She slid on her glove and flipped through them, one by one. A small folder slipped out. Pale blue, marked Alternative Case, Confidential. She picked it up, careful as if afraid the wind might take it. On top was an old photo, Malik, age 10, holding a drum, sitting beside a hospital bed. Hannah smiled gently. She didn't need anyone else to confirm it now. The truth was coming back, and this time it wouldn't be locked away in the dark. Thursday morning. Heavy rain darkened the windows of the 10th floor ethics boardroom, a space reserved strictly for the most sensitive meetings. Overhead lights cast a pale glow onto the long wooden conference table, its surface spotless and cold, echoing the weighted stillness in the room. Corbin sat at the far end of the table, fingers interlaced. His white lab coat was still neatly pressed, but his hair was disheveled, and sweat beaded along his forehead. In front of him sat 3 board members, Director Joe, 2 representatives from records, and a young chief resident physician named Jansen. No one spoke right away. On the projector screen behind them was a scanned medical file from 5 years ago, case MAL 0510. Under the heading Post-Recovery Status, a thick black line obscured nearly the entire handwritten note. Patient fully regained consciousness. No neurological deficits. A printed copy lay on the table. The ink remained sharp, though the paper had yellowed slightly with age. Hannah Lynn sat in the side chair, eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't tremble, didn't look away. I was the primary on-call attending the night the pediatric patient named Malik Iboa was admitted to the ICU that year, she began, voice steady. He came in with high fever, full-body seizures, then slipped into a prolonged coma. No light response, no spontaneous breathing. But on the 3rd night he opened his eyes, called out for his mother, then reached up and touched her face. One of the board members looked up. Was there any official note? No, Hannah replied. Dr. Corbin said at the time that no further tests were necessary. The conclusion was final reflex before brain shutdown. And then the file was withdrawn after that day. All eyes turned to Corbin. He remained silent, only his lips pressed tightly together, drawn so pale they looked bloodless. Dr. Joe placed a hand on the table and leaned forward. We found 3 clinical reports that were never entered into the main system, all from the same case file, and each one bears your handwriting. There was no denial. Jansen, the young physician, finally spoke after a pause. I don't believe in miracles. I believe in repetition and evidence. He pointed to the video replaying behind them, Marcus clearly moving, his vitals improving the moment he was touched. But if the medical system refuses to acknowledge anything it can't yet explain, then we're the ones standing in the way of medical progress. Director Joe said nothing more. He simply turned his chair toward Corbin, his gaze steady not angry, but heavy with disappointment. "Doctor?" "Corbin, as of this moment, you are suspended from all duties at Privia Care until a final decision is reached by the Ethics Board and independent review." Corbin didn't protest. He rose, gathered his documents quickly, gave a brief nod that brushed the table, and walked out. His back was straight, but his steps were heavy, as if he were dragging behind him a past he had tried to keep buried. Outside the conference room, the hallway was as cold as every morning. Sarah stood there, holding Malik's hand tightly. She wasn't wearing her lab coat. Today, she was simply Marcus's daughter, nothing more. When the door opened and Corbin stepped out, his eyes passed over her. But no words were exchanged. She said nothing either, only gripped Malik's hand a little tighter. From a distance, Aaliyah stood leaning against the wall, her gaze still as a lake. No joy, no relief. She understood all too well a late apology could never undo what had once been denied. At that same moment, a notice was issued through the hospital's internal system to all department heads. Regarding the case of patient Marcus Ellington, the hospital will be conducting an independent investigation. While we do not endorse the effectiveness of any non-medical intervention, we acknowledge a recovery that exceeded all expectations. We ask all staff to cooperate and refrain from making public statements until a conclusion is reached. Though Malik's name was never mentioned, this was the first time the system had stopped hiding. That afternoon, Malik sat beneath the glass-vaulted corridor. The rain had passed. Sunlight broke through the panels above, casting shimmering streaks like ripples across water. He didn't eat, didn't speak, just sat, flipping through a notebook. Midway through, a penciled note appeared, his own handwriting from long ago, barely legible in a child's scrawl. Not everyone can see what they hear, but anyone who still hears can still find their way back. The door had opened, and for the first time, truth stepped across the threshold of fear. That morning, there were no clouds. Sunlight streamed through the hospital's high-rise glass windows, shining directly into the ICU room where Marcus Ellington had lain motionless for over a month. The curtain had been drawn aside, and the room was flooded with more light than it had ever known. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath. Malik placed his hand on the old man's. So gently, it couldn't have been force. He hadn't brought his drum. No recording devices. Only one thing. His hand, warm, small, and quiet. Sarah stood on the other side of the bed. Her eyes never left her father's face. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't pleading anymore. She was simply waiting, as if she believed whatever was meant to happen would, that it was coming, that it would be real. And then Marcus moved, slowly, hesitantly, like someone just waking from a dream far too deep. His eyelashes trembled, his eyes began to open. Nothing clear, just light. Then came a voice, hoarse, weak, but as precise as a memory. Sarah. Her name. That one word seemed to erase every other sound in the room. Sarah wept, not out loud. Her tears fell silently onto his hand. Her shoulders shook, but her face somehow shone, like someone who had just found the first heartbeat after a long storm. Malik stepped back. He made room. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply placed his hands together in front of his chest and bowed his head like a quiet guest leaving the stage after finishing his part of the music. When Marcus was able to breathe without the machine, when his eyes could truly meet his daughter's, the questions began coming from all sides. But Sarah didn't answer right away. She brought her father to a private recovery room, away from the press. Malik no longer appeared at the hospital. No one knew where he had gone. His eyelashes trembled. His eyes cracked open. No shapes, no details, just light. Then came a voice, hoarse, weak, but as clear as memory. That day, there was a light rain. Sarah stepped into the back courtyard of the hospital, the place where she and the boy had last sat together. On the old stone bench, there was a piece of paper with a line scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I'm not good at staying, but I know when it's time to go." Beneath it sat the small drum. It no longer held sound, but inside it was a notebook. Old, ink-smudged, its pages wrinkled, filled with everything his mother had taught him about caring for the sick. Not with medicine, but with words, with warmth, and with presence. Sarah took everything home. She didn't make an announcement. No fanfare. She simply began quietly translating those principles into a pilot program at a newly established rehabilitation center named after her mother. Clara's room, where patients weren't case numbers, but people. A few months later, during an intimate gathering of donors and medical advisors, Marcus, now able to walk with crutches, stepped onto a stage for the first time since the incident. His voice was still faint, but it carried weight. "I can't explain everything with numbers, but I do know this. Sometimes, what a person needs is a hand to hold, not a treatment plan." The entire room rose to its feet, applauding, not for the speech, but because he could stand and speak. At the end of the event, Sarah made her way backstage and pulled out a thick envelope. She handed it to a woman sitting quietly in the wings, Aaliyah, Malik's mother. Inside was a full scholarship for Malik, any integrative medicine or sound therapy program in the world, his choice of school, his choice of time. Aaliyah simply smiled. She spoke very softly. "He'll choose when it's time." But thank you. Not for the scholarship, but for not turning it into a legend, for keeping it real. Years later, people still spoke of the Ellington recovery as a turning point. Not because it was miraculous, not in the way newspapers love to frame things. There was no headline that could quite contain the full truth. What happened at Clara's room, what happened to Marcus Ellington, wasn't a miracle in the divine sense. It was something slower, quieter, and in many ways harder to name. It was a shift, not in science, not exactly, but in permission. For the first time, a room of physicians, administrators, therapists, and families had witnessed what it meant for medicine to take a step back, not in surrender, but in respect. They watched, month by month, how the recovery of one man, once thought irretrievable, unfolded not through protocols, but through presence, through a boy's warm hand, through stillness, through a silence that said, "I'm not leaving you." Marcus's recovery challenged charts. It didn't follow the curve. In meetings, doctors reviewed his scans and vitals with furrowed brows. "Nothing explains it fully," one whispered, "but it's real." Eventually, they stopped trying to explain. They started to listen. To Sarah, to the nurses who noticed patterns not in numbers, but in breaths, to janitors who reported subtle changes, his eyes tracking the mop as it passed by the foot of his bed, to Malik, who never spoke to the press, never gave interviews, but returned each week with his drum strapped across his back. Even when Marcus could not speak, the boy drummed, not with rhythm designed for ears, but something deeper, like a memory trying to surface. That, perhaps, was what people meant when they said the Ellington case marked a turning point. They didn't mean the cure, they meant the care. As the years passed, the story faded from the headlines, but never from the hearts of those who were there. Sarah continued to run Clara's room not as a facility, but as a philosophy. The name became shorthand in the medical community for programs that emphasized human connection alongside clinical care. Nurses trained not only in symptom management, but in attentive presence. Volunteers were taught not to entertain, but to accompany. And patients, especially those in long-term recovery, were seen as more than stabilizing. They were growing, becoming. One hallway of Clara's room was eventually filled with photographs, not of miraculous recoveries, but of hands being held, of music played at the foot of hospital beds, of smiles that returned slowly, sometimes after months of silence. In every photo, there was a thread. Someone stayed. And Malik, no one ever quite knew where he went. Sarah received a postcard once, 2 winters after the first Ellington conference. It came without a return address. The image on the front was of a seaside town in Maine, mid-blizzard. On the back, only 2 lines were written, in a familiar, hurried hand. "Not every drum needs to be loud. Still here." She placed it in her desk drawer next to the original notebook. She never told the press. She didn't need to. Over time, whispers grew. In cities far from Clara's room, nurses reported unusual moments. A patient on hospice who hadn't spoken in days suddenly humming after a rhythmic tapping echoed from a nearby hallway. A child with severe anxiety falling asleep mid-panic after hearing what a parent described as the softest drumming, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. But no one saw the boy. Only traces. Only now and then in places where someone was thought to be lost, yet their hands were still warm, stories would surface about a boy with a drum. No speeches, no explanations. Just the beat. And then he'd be gone. And maybe that was all he ever wanted to do. Maybe not everyone believes in miracles, but sometimes what saves a person isn't the medicine. It's the fact that someone never left their side. Malik's story wasn't a supernatural miracle. It was patience. It was unconditional presence. It was love, powerful enough to stir even the places where life seemed to have left. What about you? If it were you, would you have the courage to believe in something no one has yet proven? Have you ever felt that a look, a hand, or a simple word, something so small, ended up being the one thing that held you together on your darkest days? Are you doing okay? If today feels heavy, I hope you know this. Sometimes, just having one person believe you're still here is enough. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment, share, a thought, or simply say, "Yes, I'll be here, always ready to listen."